The first time I laid eyes on that piece of junk, I didn't think it was worth the metal it was made of. I was just a kid from Arkansas, barely 20, and I didn't know much about war, but I knew that was something you didn't trust. My sergeant was the one who found it. A crumpled wing from a P-51 Mustang that had been shot down on the outskirts of our airfield. It looked like nothing more than twisted scrap. I'd seen my share of planes come and go, but nothing like this. The metal was twisted and burned, half the fuselage missing. "Take a look at that, Mac," Sergeant Edwards said, spitting out his cigarette. He had a rough way of speaking, like the words were too heavy for his mouth. His eyes were always searching, like he was looking for something that no one else could see. "Tell me what you think." I walked over, kicking the dirt beneath my boots. The sun was low that evening, casting long shadows across the wreckage. It didn't smell like victory. It smelled like oil, smoke, and blood. The wing, this mangled piece of junk, was laying there in the dirt, and all I could see was the damage. I had no faith in it. I just saw a lost cause. "Junk," I muttered, not even looking up. Sergeant Edwards looked at me for a long moment before giving a slow nod. "Junk, huh? Maybe. But there's something in that junk that'll fly again. I want you to fix it." I didn't understand at first. It didn't make sense. Why bother fixing something that looked like it had already given its last breath? But Edwards wasn't the kind of man to argue. He was a war vet, tough as nails, and he didn't explain himself. He just made sure you followed orders. So, I took the piece of junk, dragged it to the repair shed, and started working. I've fixed planes before, always something small, like an engine that needed tuning or a wheel that had taken too much of a beating. But this was different. This wasn't a quick fix. It was going to take everything I had. I had to salvage what was left of the wing and try to make it airworthy again. But as the days passed and the metal took shape under my hands, I started seeing it differently. It wasn't just a piece of junk anymore. It was a chance, a second chance. I worked on it day and night, piecing it together like a puzzle, grinding and welding, smoothing over the dents. The hours blurred together, and sometimes I wasn't sure if I was working on the plane or just trying to outrun the thoughts in my head. The war had a way of making you feel like you were drowning. I could hear the sounds of the planes overhead, the distant rumble of bombs, but none of it felt real anymore. It was just noise. What mattered was what I could touch, what I could fix. 3 weeks passed. Every day I kept at it, honing the repairs, making sure the plane would be ready. There were moments when I doubted it, when I thought it was hopeless, but something in me wouldn't let go. The sergeant had seen something I didn't, and as I stared at the repaired wing in the dim light of the hangar, I realized that sometime all you needed was a little faith in something broken. I remember the day we rolled the plane out of the shed. Edwards was standing by, watching with that calm expression on his face, like he always knew it was going to work out. The mechanic crew gathered around, murmuring to each other. No one thought it would fly, not really. But then we fired up the engine, and the sound of that Mustang's roar filled the air, drowning out everything else. And for a moment, as the plane took off, climbing into the sky, I thought I saw the sergeant smile. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. The plane had done it. That junk had flown. And then, as it soared through the sky, the thought hit me. If that plane could survive, could still fight, maybe I could too. Maybe we all could. Sometimes, it's the broken things that teach you the most about surviving. By the time we landed, that plane had become more than just metal. It had become proof that no matter how badly something is damaged, it can always be rebuilt. Even if it seems like junk, there's always something in it worth saving. So tell me, where are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let me know. It's always good to hear from you. The airfield was always alive with noise. It wasn't the kind of noise you could ignore. It was the kind that dug into your skin and stayed there, no matter how far you went. Engines roaring to life, the distant sound of artillery fire, the clattering of tools, the clink of metal. It all blended together into one unrelenting hum. The kind of sound that felt like it was coming from deep inside you, vibrating through your bones. You couldn't escape it. You didn't want to, because if you did, the silence would be worse. Every morning, the sky was a different shade of grey, and by the time the sun started fighting its way through, the airfield had already started buzzing with activity. The Mustangs were lined up in rows, their engines ticking as they cooled, each one ready to leap into the sky at a moment's notice. Pilots would check their gear, slap each other on the back, and exchange nervous grins. Some of them would joke about the weather or about the latest rumours they'd heard from the front. But deep down, we all knew the truth. None of us were immune to what was coming. The planes themselves were a constant reminder of the war. They were more than just machines. They were the only thing standing between us and the firestorm that waited in the sky. Every time I looked up, I saw them, sleek and powerful, their engines growling as they took off into the clouds. But underneath that polished surface, there was a rawness, the jagged scars of battle, the dents, the scratches, signs of survival, of the price we all paid to keep flying. The mechanics, like me, worked tirelessly to keep those planes in the air. We didn't get the glory, we didn't get the medals, but we understood something the pilots didn't. We understood the machines better than anyone else. The engines were our language, the metal our vocabulary. We didn't just fix planes, we gave them life, or at least the chance to keep going. But not every plane made it. Some came back riddled with holes, missing parts, and barely holding together. The worst ones were the ones that didn't come back at all. I'll never forget the day one of our pilots, a kid named Paul, flew out on a mission and didn't return. His plane was shot down over enemy territory, and the only thing we found was a burnt patch of earth where his Mustang had fallen. They didn't find his body. They didn't find anything of him, just a twisted pile of wreckage. When the news came through, the airfield fell silent. The engine noise, the shouting, the hammering, all of it stopped for a moment. It was like the whole world had just exhaled, holding its breath in that one moment of quiet. Then, the sound of someone's boots hitting the tarmac broke the silence. A crew chief, his face drawn tight with grief, walked to the hangar, and we all watched as he moved past the planes without a word. No one asked questions. We all knew the answer. Days passed like a blur of noise, smoke, and dust. We'd fix what we could, repair what was salvageable, and send those planes back into the sky. It became a routine. Wake up, repair, fight, and repeat. The days ran into each other, and time seemed to lose meaning. What mattered was that you made it through another day. What mattered was that you didn't break. The airfield wasn't just a place of work. It was a place where lives intersected, where every wrench turned, every part replaced, was a small victory. But it was also a place where the cost of war was always in front of you. The bodies, the broken machines, the pieces of people that scattered in the wake of battle. We didn't just rebuild planes, we rebuilt ourselves, day by day, piece by piece. One afternoon, as I stood in the hangar watching the crew work on another Mustang, I found myself thinking about the men who didn't make it back. I thought about Paul, about the others who had vanished without a trace, and I wondered if they ever thought about what they left behind. Maybe they didn't have time. Maybe they never realized they were leaving something behind at all. I was pulled from my thoughts by the sound of a plane coming in for a landing. I looked up, and for a split second, I saw that familiar silver gleam of the Mustang, the same plane I had worked on for so long. It was my plane, the one I'd fixed from that scrap, the one that had become something more than just metal. It landed hard, the wheels screeching against the tarmac as the plane skidded to a stop. The pilot, Lieutenant Harris, jumped out of the cockpit and waved to the crew. He was alive. That was all that mattered. We had saved it. We had saved him. But as I watched him walk away from the plane, I realized something that had been gnawing at me for days. In this world, everything was temporary. The planes, the people, the stories we told ourselves about what mattered. It all vanished, one mission at a time. But there was something in that plane, something that we had brought back to life, something that had fought to survive, against all odds. Maybe that's what we all were, just pieces of junk, held together by hope, trying to make it one more day. I walked over to Harris, clapping him on the back. "She held up," I said, nodding to the plane. He grinned, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Thanks to you, Mac. You kept her flying." And for a moment, standing there with the engine humming in the background, I didn't feel the weight of the war. I didn't feel the fear, the loss, or the uncertainty. I just felt alive. The morning the orders came in, I could feel the air shift. The usual buzz of the airfield seemed more electric, more charged with something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was because we all knew something big was coming. When the briefing came through, I listened carefully as the lieutenant outlined the mission. We were going up to intercept a bombing run over enemy lines, and our job was to make sure those bombers didn't make it to their target. Simple enough on paper. But out there, in the sky, it was never simple. The plan was to launch at dawn, just before the sun broke the horizon. We were to take off in tight formation, hit the bombers from above, and force them to scatter. But of course, nothing ever went according to plan. The weather had a say in the matter, as always. As we prepped the planes, a heavy mist settled over the airfield, thick enough to swallow the runway in a veil of grey. My hands moved automatically, adjusting bolts and checking the engine, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept thinking about the last mission we flew, the one where Paul never came back. It felt like yesterday, even though a month had passed. The thought of those planes, Those men still stuck with me, like a weight that wouldn't shift. When Harris climbed into Lucky Betty, the Mustang I had worked on, I stood back for a moment and watched him. He was one of the few pilots who still had that fire in his eyes. The rest of us, mechanics included, had started to wear down, our bodies tired, our minds just as drained. But Harris? Harris still had hope. He smiled as he threw a wave in my direction, then checked his gear. I walked over and slapped the side of the Mustang's fuselage. "She's ready," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was talking about the plane or Harris. The engines roared to life, one after another. The sound cut through the mist, a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the ground. I could hear the planes warming up, their engines revving, one after another, until the noise became overwhelming. The tension was in the air now, thick like the fog that hovered over the... Every mechanic was doing their part, checking the last-minute adjustments, ensuring everything was in place for the flight. No one spoke much. We didn't have to. We all understood that a lot more than the planes were going up that morning. Harris's plane was the first to leave the ground, lifting off in a smooth ascent, cutting through the grey like it was nothing. The rest of the squadron followed, and soon the roar of the engines faded into the distance. I watched until I couldn't see them anymore, then turned back to the hangar. I didn't know it then, but that was the last time I would see Harris on the ground. The hours after the planes left were the hardest. Waiting. You don't think about it when you're in the air, when you're fighting for your life. But on the ground, all you can do is wait and wait and wait some more. We had the radio on, listening to the transmissions from the fighters, but all I could focus on was the constant sound of engines in the distance. They should have been back by now. The first warning came through in a crackle of static. The call was from one of Harris's wingmen. "We've got multiple bogies, heading in fast. Can't shake 'em." The voice was frantic, and I knew exactly what that meant. We had fighters coming in, but not the kind we wanted. I clenched my fists as I listened, knowing Harris was in the thick of it. He was good, one of the best, but this wasn't just any mission. There were too many Messerschmitts. They were outnumbered. The next transmission came through in a rush of static. Lucky Betty's hit. "She's going down." I felt my chest tighten. My stomach dropped. Harris was down. I didn't even know if he was still alive, but the mission was still on. The other planes were still fighting, still pushing forward, and the ground crew, we had our work cut out for us. The radio crackled again, and this time, the message was clear. "Get ready to receive. Fighters are incoming." That was it. The moment everything changed. The airfield was about to be under attack. I ran out to the runway, grabbing whatever I could. A wrench, a rifle, anything that might help. We didn't know how many enemy fighters were coming, but the rumble of engines was unmistakable. The sky darkened as a squadron of Messerschmitts appeared out of nowhere, diving down towards us like vultures. The sound of their engines, loud and aggressive, sent a chill through my spine. The first bomb hit the perimeter of the airfield, and everything erupted in chaos. The ground shook, the shockwave rattling my teeth. I hit the dirt, covering my head instinctively, feeling the heat from the explosion even from where I lay. When I looked up, I saw the hangars on fire, smoke billowing into the sky, and men running in every direction. But I couldn't move, not yet. Another wave of enemy fighters screamed overhead, and I saw our planes scattered on the tarmac, trying to take off in the madness. I barely had time to react before I saw the flash of fire, the terrible, familiar sound of bullets tearing into metal. The first plane went down in flames and I saw the smoke rising. Through the chaos, I spotted Harris's Mustang, Lucky Betty, still in the sky. It was smoking, but it was still flying. He was still fighting, and that gave me a glimmer of hope. I didn't realize it at the time, but I had become part of something bigger than just a mechanic. In that moment, I wasn't just fixing planes anymore. I was fighting alongside those men, pushing back against the impossible. And I knew, no matter how many planes went down, no matter how many men fell, we weren't done yet. We had to keep going. We had to fight, or we wouldn't make it back. By the time the last of the enemy fighters had retreated, the damage was done. We had lost planes, we had lost men, but we had also held our ground. And through the smoke, the fire, and the chaos, I saw Lucky Betty come back around, battered, but still intact. Harris had made it. He'd survived. When he landed, I didn't wait for him to step out of the cockpit. I ran to the plane, and as soon as I saw him, I slapped him on the back. He grinned, though it was hard to tell if he was happy or just relieved. "We made it," I said. "We made it back." And for a moment, as I looked up at the sky, I knew that sometimes, even when everything around you is falling apart, you find a way to keep flying. The aftermath of the attack felt like a bad dream that you couldn't wake up from. The airfield was in ruins, smoke and ash hanging in the air like a fog that wouldn't lift. The fires were the worst part. They burned long after the last enemy fighter had retreated, long after the bombers had gone home. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at the wreckage, but the world around me felt still, like the entire place was holding its breath. It's strange. In the heat of battle, everything moves fast, but when it's over, time slows down. You start hearing things you didn't hear before. The distant crackle of flames, the moans of the wounded, the silence of those who didn't make it. The wind felt cold against my skin, and as I stepped over debris, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. I couldn't help but think of Harris. Lucky Betty was in pieces, charred and mangled, sitting near the edge of the runway. I didn't know what had happened to him after he landed. He'd made it back, but what cost? We'd lost so much. Men, planes, the very airfield itself. And for what? A temporary victory, a few more days of survival. I walked toward the wreckage of one of the Mustangs, my boots crunching on the debris. The wing was shattered, the engine completely destroyed. The smell of burning fuel mixed with the acrid stench of smoke, and I had to stop for a moment to catch my breath. I ran my hand over the jagged metal, feeling the twisted remnants of what had once been a weapon of war, something that had flown, fought, and now lay broken on the ground. It was hard not to see it as a metaphor for everything that had happened, the destruction, the chaos, the lives torn apart. I found the others scattered around, doing what they could to salvage what was left. Some of them were searching for anything useful in the wreckage, others were tending to the wounded, and some had simply collapsed, too exhausted to do anything but sit and stare. There was no leadership left. We were all just surviving, and even that felt like a stretch. The medics were working furiously, patching up the men who had made it back, but had been torn apart by the assault. I didn't know how many were going to make it. I didn't even know how many we had lost. It didn't matter. The feeling of loss was already there, hanging over us like a heavy cloud. Harris wasn't in the crowd. He wasn't in the hangar. I asked around, but no one had seen him after he landed. The last thing I remembered was seeing him climb out of the cockpit, his face covered in soot and sweat. He'd looked tired, but he'd been smiling. I needed to find him. I made my way through the wreckage, calling his name, but the sound of it seemed swallowed by the noise around me. The fires, the shouting, the broken planes. It all blurred together. I kept moving, trying to clear my mind. I knew the chances of finding him were slim, but I had to look. When I found him, he was sitting on the ground, his back against a half-burned crate. His flight suit was torn in places, and his helmet was nowhere to be seen. He was staring at the sky, the same sky we'd all fought for, and I knew, even before I walked over to him, that something had changed in him. He didn't look up when I approached. He just sat there, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes lost in the distance. "Harris," I said softly, kneeling next to him. He turned slowly, his face pale, his eyes empty. It was the first time I'd seen him like this. Not angry, not determined, just empty. "I made it back," he said quietly, his voice distant, "but I don't know what for." I didn't know how to respond. What do you say to a man who's seen too much, who survived only to realize that the price of survival was his own soul? I sat next to him, not speaking. Sometimes words didn't help. Sometimes silence was the only thing that made sense. We sat there for what felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. The fires still burned around us, casting long shadows, but the world felt like it had stopped. I couldn't think about the battle anymore. I couldn't think about the planes, the mission, the war. All I could think about was the men we'd lost, the lives we'd destroyed, and the ones who were still here, somehow still here. Finally, Harris broke the silence. "It's not the dying that gets to you," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's the living, the ones who have to keep going after it's all over, the ones who carry this with them." He gestured vaguely to the field, the wreckage, the smouldering remains of planes and men alike. "We're all just broken pieces now." I didn't know what to say to that, because he was right. We were all broken. The war had taken so much from us, and no one was going to leave without carrying a piece of it with them. But I also knew something else. As long as we were alive, we still had a chance. As long as we kept going, even if it was just for one more day, one more mission, we could still make something of what was left. I stood up slowly and offered my hand to Harris. "We're not done yet," I said quietly. "We're still here, and as long as we're still here, we're still fighting." He looked up at me, his eyes softening just a little. He took my hand, and for a moment it felt like the old Harris was there again, the one who had that fire in his eyes, the one who had a reason to keep fighting. He nodded, the barest of smiles forming on his lips. Yeah, I guess we are." We didn't say anything else as we walked back to the others. There was too much to process, too much pain to deal with. But for the first time since the attack, I felt a spark of something again. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just the knowledge that we could still find meaning in the wreckage. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. We weren't done yet. The days that followed felt like they dragged on forever, each one blending into the next in a haze of smoke, debris, and unanswered questions. We rebuilt what we could. The planes we could salvage, the equipment that wasn't completely destroyed. We worked on it day and night, trying to piece together what was left. But there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something that could never be fixed. It wasn't until a week later that I got the call. I was sitting in the mess hall, drinking coffee that tasted like burnt rubber and bad decisions when the lieutenant walked in, his face pale, his eyes haunted. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the doorway, like he was trying to figure out how to break the news. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, like he didn't want to be heard. "Harris didn't make it, Mac," he said. "He didn't make it out of the hospital." I felt the ground shift beneath me, like I had stepped off a ledge, and there was nothing left to hold me up. Harris, the same guy who had fought through the flames, who had laughed in the face of danger, who had smiled at me just days ago after flying a mission that should have killed him, he was gone. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. All I could feel was that deep, gut-wrenching emptiness that hit you when you realized someone you cared about was never coming back. I didn't go to the hospital to see him. I should have, but I didn't. Part of me didn't want to believe it. Part of me kept telling myself that somehow Harris would pull through. He always did. But this time, he didn't. And it hit harder than anything I'd ever felt in this war. The funeral was small. A few men from the squadron gathered around the gravesite, and a chaplain said some words that didn't mean anything. They never do. I stood there, my hands in my pocket, feeling the weight of Harris's absence like it was a physical thing, something I could touch. The others around me seemed just as lost, their faces grim, their eyes hollow. No one spoke much. What could we say? Harris was gone, and the war had taken another piece of us with him. When the service ended, I found myself alone, standing by the edge of the cemetery, staring at the ground. The world felt too loud. The war, the engines, the shouts, the endless noise, it all felt too much. I could hear Harris's voice in my head, the way he always joked, the way he smiled, even when we all knew we were walking straight into hell. I reached into my pocket and pulled out that small piece of metal, the one I had carried since the day we fixed Lucky Betty. It was cold now, the edges worn smooth by the years and the stories we had told about it. I hadn't even realized I was still carrying it, but in that moment, holding it in my hand, I realized that the plane, that scrap of metal, had become more than just a piece of junk. It had become a symbol of everything we had survived, of everything we had lost. I sat down on a nearby bench, the piece of metal resting in my palm, and I let the quiet settle in around me. I thought about everything we had gone through, the bombings, the missions, the men we had lost, and the ones who had made it out, only to be broken in ways no one could understand. I thought about the times I had tried to fix things, to rebuild something that had been destroyed, the planes, the engines of war. But what I hadn't realized until now was that the thing I needed to fix the most wasn't the planes. It wasn't even the war. It was me. The loss of Harris hit me harder than I wanted to admit. He was my friend, the one person who had always been there, the one who had kept me going when it felt like everything else was falling apart. He was gone, and I had no idea how to live in a world where that was true. There were no answers, no easy ways to fix what had been broken. But as I sat there, holding the piece of metal, I realized that maybe that was the point. Maybe there was no fixing it. Maybe there was only surviving. Maybe that's all we ever had left. To keep going, even when the pieces didn't fit. To keep fighting, even when it felt like we were already broken. I stood up slowly, slipping the piece of metal back into my pocket. It was a small thing, a broken piece of a plane, but it felt heavy, like it carried the weight of everything I had lost and everything I was still trying to hold on to. I looked around the graveyard once more, my mind filled with memories of Harris, of the times we had laughed, the times we had fought side by side. And then, just before I walked away, I stopped. I turned back and looked at his grave one last time. "We're not done yet, Harris," I whispered. "I'll keep flying. For both of us." The war didn't end when the planes stopped flying. No one ever told us. They told us that once we won, once the enemy was defeated, it would be over. But the truth is, when the battle ended, it only left the wounds behind, the scars, the empty spaces, the faces that would never come back. They don't teach you how to carry those things. No one tells you how to carry the weight of what you've done, what you've seen. You don't just walk away from it. It stays with you, follows you everywhere you go. Even now, when I think about the war, it doesn't feel like something that happened to someone else. It feels like it happened to me. Like I'm still there, somewhere in the smoke and the wreckage, waiting for the next attack to come. After Harris's death, it took me a long time to find a way to keep going. The days felt like they stretched on forever, each one heavier than the last. I returned to the same hangar where we had worked, the same tools and engines surrounding me, but it all felt different. I could still hear Harris's voice in my head, the way he always joked about getting out of this hellhole. The sound of his laughter was the only thing that ever made me forget where I was. Now, it was just silence. The silence after the battle, after the loss, after the life you thought would be there, but wasn't. There's no easy way to process a loss like that. I found myself working on planes again, fixing engines, welding fuselages, but my hands weren't the same. They were steady, but they weren't sure anymore. The planes were no longer just metal and machines. They were ghosts, carrying the souls of the men who had flown them. When I worked, I felt like I was piecing together pieces of people who had already been torn apart. Some days, it felt like all I could do was hold on to what was left, not just of the planes, but of the memory. I still couldn't get over the feeling of Harris's absence. He had been more than just a pilot. He had been a reminder of why we kept fighting, why we kept going even when it didn't make sense. His optimism had been the last thing that kept me from losing myself to the war. Now that he was gone, I didn't know what to do with the space he had left behind. I didn't know who I was without him, without that piece of hope he had carried with him. And yet, there was a part of me that didn't want to let go of the war, either. As much as it tore me apart, as much as it broke me down, I couldn't walk away. The war had become part of who I was. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about remembering the ones who hadn't made it back, about honoring the men who had fought beside me, who had sacrificed everything for something they believed in. It wasn't about victory anymore. It was about the fight itself. The longer I stayed, the more I began to realize that the war wasn't something you could just forget. It wasn't something you could just walk away from. It stayed with you. The sound of the engines, the faces of the men you had fought beside, the names of the ones you had lost, they were always there, lingering in the back of your mind. Sometimes, I'd hear the roar of an engine and think it was a Mustang coming in for a landing, and my heart would stop for a second, thinking it was Harris, but it wasn't. It never was. In some ways, I think the hardest part of survival is dealing with the silence that comes after. The war gives you so much noise, so much chaos, that you don't realize how loud it's been until it's over. And when it stops, you're left with yourself, alone with your thoughts, your memories, your regrets. You start questioning everything you've done, everything you've survived. Was it worth it? Were the sacrifices worth the cost? And in those quiet moments, when there's no one else around, you realize that there are no answers. There's just the knowledge that you survive. And that survival is a kind of victory in itself. I found myself walking the airfield at night, just to feel something. The engines were silent, the planes parked and covered, but I could still feel the weight of everything. The hangars stood like sentinels in the darkness, and the faint glow of the moon reflected off the metal like it was still alive. In those moments, I didn't feel alone. I felt connected to the men who had fought here, who had walked these same paths, who had stood where I stood and looked at the same sky. I didn't have any answers for what happened to us. I didn't know why some men made it back and others didn't. But I knew this. We were all broken in our own way. The war had taken something from every one of us, and we had all been changed by it. But maybe, in the end, that was the point. Maybe the war wasn't about winning. Maybe it was about surviving. And maybe that's all any of us could do. Just keep going, one step at a time, carrying the weight of the past with us, but never letting it drag us down. I don't know when it happened. Maybe it was after a few too many nights of staring at the stars, thinking about what could have been. But eventually, I realized that the war had already taken everything, the people I had loved, the things I had hoped for. All I had left was what I carried inside me, the memories, the faces, the lessons. And in that moment, I knew that if I was going to survive, I couldn't keep holding on to what had been. I had to let go, just a little. I had to find a way to move forward, even if the past would always be. I don't know how much of the old me was left, but I knew this. I was still here, and that, in itself, was something worth fighting for. In the end, it's not about the medals or the glory. It's not about the planes we flew or the bombs we dropped. It's about the memories, the faces, the voices, the names of the men who were there and the men who never came back. That's what I've learned over the years. What matters is what we leave behind, the things we carry with us, even after the war ends. It's strange to think about how something so brutal, so relentless, could shape who you are in ways you never expected. You start off believing that survival is the goal, that the fight is the only thing that matters. But when it's over, you realize that it's the small moments, the moments when you laugh, when you fight for each other, when you hold on to something that doesn't make sense, that carry the most weight. That's what stays with you. That's what you hold on to when everything else is gone. I've carried those memories with me, long after the war ended. The sound of engines roaring in the distance, the smell of fuel and dust, the faces of the men who shared those moments with me. I still think about Harris. I still think about all of them. The ones who made it, the ones who didn't, and the ones who came home only to find themselves broken in ways that no one could fix. But even with all the loss, I can't bring myself to regret any of it, because as much as it took from me, the war also gave me something. It gave me a sense of purpose, the knowledge that no matter what happens, we can always keep going. We can always find something worth fighting for, even in the darkest of times. And I know that, somewhere in the wreckage, in the ruins of everything that's fallen apart, there's still something worth holding on to. So, I guess that's why I'm telling this story now. It's not for me. It's not for the recognition or the attention. It's for them. The men who didn't make it back. The ones who gave everything to keep us going. It's for the ones who fought not for glory, but for the people who mattered to them. I don't want their stories to be forgotten. I don't want their sacrifices to be lost in time. If you've listened this far, if this story has meant something to you, then I ask one thing. Don't forget. Don't forget the price of survival, the weight of what we carry with us. Share this story. Keep their memories alive. It's the least we can do for the ones who can't tell their own story anymore. If you're still here, if you've been through your own battle, your own struggle, I want you to know you're not alone. We're all carrying something, and sometimes just knowing someone else has made it through the darkness is enough to keep you going. So, if you're still with me, if this story has given you something, take a moment to hit that like button. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because as long as we keep telling these stories, as long as we keep remembering, no one truly ever falls. We all have our own wars to fight, our own battles to win. But as long as we fight them together, as long as we keep each other's stories alive, we'll always have a chance.